They marched them through the gates like a curious, terrible promise. Neat rows of German prisoners, helmets tucked under arms, newspapers folded with the same careless dignity they had carried into war. In the photographs, they look absurdly ordinary. Young men in cold smiles, escorted past wooden barracks and white picket fences, led to baseball games and mess halls where temperature and politeness seemed to have been carefully measured for them. Across town, in the same country they were accused of attacking, another march was ignited by a different kind of duty. Black soldiers in khaki moved through the same streets not as guests, but as guests who must not sit. They carried the same ration packs, shouldered the same weight of fear, returned from the same amphibious beaches. And yet, when the war's applause faded, they were told to wait their turn for dignity. In one snapshot, a black corporal folds his hands at the back of a segregated chow line, while a German POW is shown sitting at a table being served. The irony is so sharp it slices. Imagine a mother in Mississippi receiving a letter from her son in uniform. "We fight for freedom," he writes, ink smeared with the mud of foreign shores. She pins the letter to the wall beside the calendar, then walks past colored-only signs on her way to the grocery. The calendar keeps flipping. The war's rhetoric, freedom, democracy, civilization, becomes a private, painful joke between the kitchen and the dining table. These are not mere anecdotes. They are fissures in a national story told with high, righteous voices. A country at war against tyranny while tolerating, at home, a bureaucracy of second-class humanity. The contradiction is not elegant. It is corrosive. It eats at the premise of why men enlisted, why families sacrificed. If a nation cannot extend basic decency to its own, how do we expect it to lecture the world? So here is the hard, stingy truth we open with. Somewhere between Geneva's rules and small-town customs, America created a moral ledger with different columns for skin color and nationality, and in too many places the enemy received better treatment than the citizen who looked like the country he served. The story doesn't begin in the prison camps. It begins in the uniforms, in who was allowed to wear them, and how they were meant to fit. By the time the United States entered World War II, segregation wasn't just a Southern habit. It was federal policy dressed in military precision. Black soldiers were drafted, trained, and shipped to war in separate units, often commanded by white officers who doubted their intelligence, their discipline, their worth. The Army called it standard procedure. History would later call it hypocrisy. In towns like Fort Benning, Georgia, and Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, young black recruits trained beside rows of white tents that weren't theirs. They marched past cafeterias they couldn't enter, theaters that closed their doors to them, and churches that prayed for victory without ever mentioning equality. Jim Crow wasn't suspended for the war effort. It simply put on a uniform of its own. The contradiction became almost comic, if it weren't so cruel. America's war propaganda plastered every wall. This is a war for democracy. Freedom will prevail. Fight tyranny abroad. But when black soldiers stepped onto buses marked colored only, those slogans turned into background noise. Slogans meant for someone else. The laughter in the back rows of segregated troop trains wasn't amusement. It was disbelief disguised as endurance. And yet they fought. They fought because the promise of democracy still shimmered somewhere, fragile and unfinished. The Double V campaign, victory abroad, victory at home, became their quiet rebellion. Black newspapers from Pittsburgh to Chicago printed the slogan beneath photos of smiling young men in uniform, their optimism unshaken by the irony they lived in. Meanwhile, as America captured thousands of German soldiers in North Africa and Europe, a question of logistics arose. Where do we keep them? The answer was almost poetic in its perversity. Inside the same southern towns where black Americans couldn't vote, German prisoners would soon build roads, harvest crops, and attend church picnics under watchful but courteous guards. The War Department promised humane treatment under the Geneva Convention. Local farmers promised cheap labor. And the United States, unknowingly, promised to expose the absurdity of its own moral geometry. White enemies as guests, black soldiers as outsiders. By 1944, over 400,000 German POWs were housed across America. Many of them worked in fields alongside black civilians who weren't allowed to eat in the same diners. Some even wrote letters home describing the kindness of their American captors. It was a strange, inverted mirror of freedom. one that reflected not victory, but the shadow behind it. It happened quietly, in the middle of a Louisiana spring. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, a black soldier from the 224th Quartermaster Battalion, sat inside a train car heading back to base. He wore his uniform proudly, polished buttons, creased trousers, and a rank patch that said he'd earned his place. Across the aisle, white soldiers chatted idly. The train slowed near a small-town station, and something peculiar caught his eye. A group of German prisoners of war, blonde, sunburned, some barely older than boys, were being escorted into the station cafe. The guards followed them inside, chatting amiably. Moments later, Trimmingham watched as waitresses served them coffee, pie, and sandwiches on clean plates. When he and his black comrades stepped off the train, they were stopped. The same waitress who had smiled at the German boys crossed her arms and said, "We don't serve colored here." The absurdity hung in the air like gunpowder. Here were men who had bled for a flag, turned away from a meal, while men who had tried to destroy that flag were fed like neighbors. The humiliation was so sharp that Trimmingham later wrote about it in a letter to Yank magazine. His question was simple, almost painfully polite. Open quote, "Are we not American soldiers?" Close quote. That question ripped through the country's conscience like shrapnel. The War Department pretended not to hear. But black newspapers, Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, Baltimore Afro-American, reprinted the letter across their front pages. It became a quiet rallying cry, an indictment written not in rage, but in weary patriotism. And it wasn't an isolated incident. In Texas, German POWs were invited to eat in restaurants that turned away black officers in uniform. In Alabama, POWs worked freely in cotton fields while local black citizens needed permits just to travel between counties. In Georgia, a white farmer was quoted saying, "The Germans are polite, clean boys, not like them colored soldiers." That sentence, more than any weapon, revealed the true hierarchy of America's wartime morality. Some POWs even expressed disbelief. One German, interviewed after the war, recalled asking his American guard, "Why do you treat us better than them?" The guard shrugged. "That's just how things are down here." It was meant as an explanation. It sounded like a confession. What Rupert Trimmingham exposed wasn't a momentary lapse in decency. It was a mirror that reflected a nation's paradox, fighting fascism abroad while negotiating with racism at home. And the reflection was ugly. You could almost mistake it for dark comedy, if it weren't real. A nation mobilized to defend democracy ended up giving the velvet treatment to men who had sworn allegiance to Hitler, while its own citizens, those who built the tanks, filled the bullets, and wore the same uniform, stood outside, waiting for permission to sit. The theater of absurdity didn't need playwrights. America was writing it live. The United States loved to describe itself as the arsenal of freedom. Factories thundered day and night, pumping out weapons for the world's salvation. But inside the barracks and bus depots, freedom was rationed by skin tone. A black soldier could die for the Constitution. He just couldn't use it. That contradiction was no accident. It was design. The Army's segregation policy mirrored the country's moral blueprint. Officers called it practical. Politicians called it tradition. And generals said it maintained order. Translation, it was easier to fight Nazis than to fight your own prejudice. Racism, after all, didn't require a draft. It was already enlisted. And the cruelest irony? The Geneva Convention, signed to protect the dignity of captured enemy soldiers, worked exactly as intended. German POWs were treated with humanity because international law demanded it. But there was no Geneva Convention for being black in America. No clause, no protocol, no committee to remind white diners in Texas that wearing a U.S. uniform should be enough to earn a seat at a lunch counter. Let that sink in. The moral compass of a global war depended on how you defined enemy. For America, the enemy wore a swastika overseas, but at home, the enemy was simply someone who challenged the social order. That's why a black soldier could be punished for demanding respect, while a Nazi could be praised for saying, "Sir." This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was hierarchy disguised as patriotism. The polite smile of the waitress, the shrug of the guard, the bureaucratic memo justifying separate facilities, they weren't random acts of cruelty. They were the machinery of a country terrified of its own reflection. And yet, even in this moral fog, something extraordinary began to stir. Black soldiers wrote letters. Black journalists printed them. Communities whispered, then shouted. Every pie served to a POW and denied to an American became an exhibit in the quiet trial of a nation's conscience. History, with its dry textbooks and ceremonial parades, likes to skip this part. But here's the uncomfortable truth. For many Americans in the 1940s, the war wasn't against fascism, it was against irony itself. Because nothing mocked freedom more efficiently than watching the enemy eat first. To understand how such absurdity could exist, you have to look at the structure that built it, the layered sediment of laws, customs, and fears that made up Jim Crow America. The American South in the 1940s was not a battlefield. It was an architecture. A system so carefully constructed that even the chaos of World War could not shake it. Separate schools, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate everything, except the hypocrisy. That part was shared by all. When German POWs arrived, they entered this system as outsiders, yet somehow landed higher in its hierarchy than Black Americans who had been born under the flag. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the U.S. was legally required to provide humane treatment to captured soldiers, decent food, fair housing, medical care, recreation. Washington followed the rules meticulously, not just out of decency, but fear. If America mistreated Axis POWs, it risked retaliation against U.S. prisoners held in Europe and Asia. But what international law did for the enemy, domestic law refused to do for its citizens. Jim Crow wasn't just a Southern relic. It was federal complicity in moral cowardice. Segregation was baked into military policy, approved by Congress, defended by the War Department, and accepted by presidents who didn't want to lose Southern votes. Roosevelt needed a united front against fascism. Confronting racism could wait. So while black regiments loaded supplies, German POWs were allowed to work side by side with white civilians, sometimes earning better rations and access to local facilities. POWs picked peaches in Georgia, cut timber in Arkansas, harvested wheat in Kansas. They were paid in coupons and treated like disciplined guests. Meanwhile, black sharecroppers in those same counties labored under debt contracts that hadn't changed since Reconstruction. What happened in those towns was not an anomaly. It was an equation. Race, nationality. It didn't matter that a POW's uniform bore an eagle clutching a swastika. It only mattered that his skin was white. For the white South, that made him more civilized than any black man in uniform. And yet, paradoxically, the global war began to erode that very logic. As the United States broadcast propaganda about freedom and human rights, other nations, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, began to notice the contradictions. Newspapers in London and Paris mocked the democracy of segregation. Soviet radio broadcasts used American racism as proof of capitalist hypocrisy. The world was watching, and America's moral facade was cracking. At home, the Double V campaign gained momentum. Black newspapers turned Trimmingham's letter into an emblem of endurance, reminding readers that victory abroad meant nothing without victory at home. Civil rights activists began to frame equality not as a plea for kindness, but as a test of America's credibility in the post-war world. The irony deepened. The war meant to defend democracy became the mirror that forced America to see its own unfinished revolution. The war ended, but the mirror didn't fade. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the ghosts of contradiction followed the soldiers home. America celebrated victory over fascism while quietly hoping its own racial fault lines would stay buried under parades and medals. But history doesn't stay buried, it seeps. In 1945, train stations filled again, not with German POWs this time, but with black veterans returning from war. They had stormed Normandy, flown bomber missions, built bridges across the Rhine. They came back wearing ribbons and believing, perhaps naively, that their sacrifice had earned them a different kind of citizenship. Instead, they found the same signs still nailed to the walls. Colored entrance. No Negroes allowed. Whites only. Some were beaten in uniform. Some were murdered for forgetting their place. In February 1946, Sergeant Isaac Woodard, still in his Army uniform, was dragged off a bus in South Carolina and blinded by a police chief's baton. His crime? Asking to use a restroom. He had survived Hitler, only to lose his sight to Jim Crow. His case and others like it sent shockwaves through the conscience of post-war America. The contradiction had become impossible to ignore. White America's illusion of moral innocence cracked further when German POWs, now repatriated, wrote back to their American acquaintances. Some of them expressed genuine gratitude, others expressed confusion. "You called us your enemies," one letter read, "but we were treated better than your own people." It was meant without malice. It landed like an indictment. And yet, from that darkness came motion. Trimmingham's letter, Woodard's blindness, and thousands of quiet humiliations became the seeds of a movement. Black veterans returned not just with scars, but with clarity. They had seen Europe, seen what freedom could look like, and they weren't going back quietly. They wrote petitions, joined the NAACP, ran for office, and began demanding, in the language of service and sacrifice, what America owed them. President Harry S. Truman, a man not known for moral radicalism, finally looked at the contradiction too long to ignore. In 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. military. It was not an act of compassion. It was an act of pressure, a recognition that America could no longer preach democracy abroad while practicing apartheid at home. The twist, then, is not that justice triumphed, it's that shame forced movement. The same system that once served pie to Nazis and turned away black soldiers began, reluctantly, to dismantle itself under the weight of its own hypocrisy. But the damage was done. The question Rupert Trimmingham asked, "Are we not American soldiers?" had already become something larger. Are we not Americans, period? History has a way of healing only what it's willing to remember. For decades, the story of German POWs treated better than black soldiers lingered in footnotes, archived in military reports and dusty newspapers that no one cited in schoolbooks. But every so often, a photograph or a letter would resurface, and the question would echo again, quiet but sharp. What does freedom mean if it isn't shared? Rupert Trimmingham never became famous. He wasn't a general or a politician. He was an ordinary man who dared to write a simple truth in an extraordinary time. His letter outlived him, passed through classrooms, civil rights meetings, documentaries, and eventually the internet. Every generation rediscovers it like an accusation that refuses to age. His story, and those of men like him, laid the moral foundation for what would follow. The sit-ins of Greensboro, the marches on Selma, the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who once called segregation a kind of psychological warfare against your own citizens. It was the same war Trimmingham had already fought, not against Germany, but against the idea that dignity could be conditional. The image of a German POW being served in an American cafe while a black soldier was turned away isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a parable, one that exposes the distance between America's ideals and America's instincts. It reminds us that democracy isn't a destination, it's a maintenance job, one that demands more honesty than pride. In hindsight, the humiliation of those soldiers became something unintended, a catalyst. It revealed that freedom, when unevenly distributed, becomes propaganda. It forced America to confront the truth that the real enemy was never across the ocean, but within its own habits. In the quiet comfort of those who could look at injustice and call it the way things are. Today, when we speak of patriotism, we like to imagine the flag as a symbol of unity. But perhaps the most patriotic act in 1944 wasn't fighting in France. It was writing a letter from a train, asking the nation to practice what it preached. And that's the enduring lesson. Wars end, but the battle for integrity never does. The measure of a country isn't how it treats its enemies. It's how it treats the people who believe in it, even when it doesn't believe in them.